Good evening, everyone. Not on? Hello? Okay, hi everyone. There's nothing I love more than a room that's buzzing, so I'm glad that you guys are all together for, I guess, a shared topic, and you're all happy to see each other, and I guess I'm hoping, enthused that we're here to talk about something that's so important. My name is Tess Hemian. I am the Manager of Advocacy and Communications with the Autism Society. I've been lucky enough to be there for 3 years, and this is the first time we're doing a panel about a topic that's perhaps the most important one that I came to know when I first started there. Where people live matters, that's for sure. So I want to welcome you all here this evening. Those of you who are elected officials, or you work in government, or you're a mom, or you're a dad, or you're a friend, or you're a sister, or you're a brother, or you're a service provider, welcome here tonight. And welcome to everyone who is listening online. This is being streamed across the province, so people in every nook and cranny that has internet can hear us right now. So welcome. You know, there's going to be a lot of topics that are going to come up here this evening, many of which are very important. So we're going to encourage the panelists to give us their perspective and their personal experience. But more than anything, what we want to get out of this night is solutions. I think that government knows, people who work in government know and care that this issue needs to be addressed. And what my role needs to be is to be able to tell what the solutions to those need to be. So I really encourage you to bring that forward. If you don't feel as though it was heard here tonight, whether or not it's a panelist or yourself standing at the end or writing a comment, I encourage you to get in touch with us, email us. We want to hear from you. You are the ones that matter. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Anthony. Anthony Germain is with CBC's Here and Now, and he has kindly agreed to moderate this very, very important topic. So Anthony, come on up.
Thank you, Tessa. Yeah, when I was invited to come here, I really didn't hesitate, or at least I don't think I did, because when I was on the St. John's Morning Show and also with Here and Now, there are two things that really made me interested in the Elaine Dobbin Centre. One is that I have some friends who have dealt with a young man who I've known since he was 5, who I love dearly, who's very talented, excellent musician. But when he was 5, nobody ever figured this guy would be a great guitarist, cellist, sax player. And now he's in university, and he means a lot to me. And for those of us who haven't had to deal with it, and as a journalist, I think that there's a large number of people in Newfoundland and Labrador who don't understand the challenge down the road if you take a look at the numbers and what we are facing. So tonight's topic is actually really important. And I'm with Tessa. You know, you can identify the problem and dwell on everything that doesn't work, and to a certain degree tonight, you need to mention the problem. But dwelling on it's not going to fix it. So try to think about what solutions might work. And the other reason that I really like working with the Autism Centre is that when we're desperate for a story, it's just across the street from the CBC, so we can always make our deadline. So that kind of helps too. A lot to cover, so I think I'll just let you know there are 2 ways that you can be part of this when the time comes. I think there's some cards on your chairs. You can write your question when we get to the question period, and 1/3 of tonight is dedicated to you, so there will be a chance. Or there'll be a microphone and you can pose your question. If you don't want to ask it, you can write it on the paper and somebody else will ask you, we'll actually read the question for you. Okay? And if I could ask everyone to put your phones on stun or vibrate, that will help a night without disruption. Okay, so I think what I'll do is I'll just go from the panel right this way to the end and have the panelists briefly introduce themselves, and we'll get the evening going.
Okay, good evening, thank you. My name is David Philpott. I'm Department Head of Special Education at Memorial University. I was a member of the Premier's Task Force on Improving Educational Outcomes last year. And ironically enough, I started my career 35 years ago by working in a group home with young adults who had developmental disabilities. And I learned more in that year, in that role with those citizens, than I have in all my university courses combined. And today, 35 years later, we're back having the conversation about the need for residential supports for citizens in our community. So it's great to be here. Great to see you here.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Bruce Pierce. I'm the community development worker with End Homelessness St. John's, and I've performed that role since 2002, but I had a long-standing interest and involvement in housing solutions dating back to probably the 1980s. I think I went on a street patrol as a journalism student at Carleton back in the 80s, and it was a cold winter night, and we were looking for people who were experiencing homelessness. And that issue really grew since that time, and I worked on addressing homelessness in the city of Toronto, working for a councillor and for a provincial member of parliament, and ended up in Newfoundland, Labrador. I thought, I'm not going to see that issue here. Everyone's just way too nice, and we all take care of each other. But the same forces are at play in all parts of the country. So I'm really excited to be here tonight because I want to learn a lot from you and from the conversation. And in the work that we do with End Homelessness St. John's, we're just now putting to bed our current plan to end homelessness, which had a 5-year trajectory the last few years. We've seen an 18% decrease in emergency shelter use in the city, but that's we can't celebrate. We have a long way to go, and there's a lot of people who are living on the edge. And from my conversations with folks here, we're going to be talking about that. People who need, we need to have a longer-term vision to prevent homelessness down the road and housing instability. So we're writing a new plan this year. The City of St. John's is writing one, and the provincial government, and so is the federal government. I've never seen anything like this before in my time working on this issue. So there's an opportunity to get all of the performers in the orchestra working together, and we need your help to help make it a good plan that's actually going to have an impact at all levels.
Okay, my name is Trudy Gould. I'm autistic. I was only officially diagnosed in 2012, shortly after I moved here. And I sort of experienced the issue with getting supports for residential services myself. My mother's in the audience. She could tell you we spent months and years trying to find a way to get me an apartment of my own. I did finally get one, but there are still supports that I need. So that's one of the things I'm planning to talk about today. I've also recently gotten heavily involved in autism advocacy. So that's another part of the reason I'm here today. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you both learn something and teach something to us.
Thank you, Trudy, so much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Janet Miller-Pitt. I've spent 30 years working as a planner in social and economic development. I'm very glad I did, because my working life, which was focused on service, on advocacy and solutions and action planning, became the spine that supported me in my private life. I have an adult daughter living with Down syndrome. She is 28. And I have become recently the main support for my nephew, who is an adult living with autism, and he is 38. His caregivers both died, his grandmother and mother, within 9 months of each other, and he found himself without the people who were most important in his life and without a home because of the circumstances that had occurred in our family. And he needed to have a life as an adult that realized his potential, that kept him safe, that met his needs. So tonight I'm privileged to share with you, and with his permission, aspects of his story and how we have come as far as we have. I'm especially interested, both for my daughter and also for Chris, on that transition and planning that happens after diagnosis, after education, as adults who are living with disabilities face their future with and without their families. So my focus tonight is on, I hope I have something to contribute, and I'm sure I'll have something to learn on how we have that conversation before crisis about future planning, including and focus tonight on residential living and supports.
Good evening. My name is Jacqueline Cook. I'm a retired teacher, and I have a son who was recently diagnosed as being on the spectrum, and he's no longer living with me. And I'm hoping that the discussion this evening will highlight many of the issues that we're all facing.
Right, thank you. So these are people, a nice eclectic bunch with different points of view. And so let me get right to the first question, our prepared question, and that is, last week the provincial government announced a comprehensive autism action plan in their The Way Forward document. And so the question is, what needs to be considered to meet the unique needs of individuals on the spectrum seeking housing? So perhaps, David, perhaps you can comment on what you've seen work in the past. What needs to happen, to exist, what needs to be there for these adults to thrive?
Okay, I'll start the conversation, I guess. This is, in some ways, this is a brand new conversation because the needs of citizens with autism spectrum disorder are unique in our community from an adult perspective. I started my career, I did my training in the early 80s. Autism was not in my course syllabus. The word wasn't mentioned. I did no training on it whatsoever. It simply did not exist. And within the first 5 to 10 years of my teaching career, we started to see these children move in who had highly complex, highly individualized needs called autism. And it's gone from that scarce new thing in the early 80s to this mushroom we now see moving through the school system, having taxed the K-12 school system because they weren't ready for what came. And now these citizens are moving into the communities. And they will tax the adult system because they're not ready for the number of citizens moving forward. Back in the early 80s, we had Exxon House. If anyone over 50 can remember Exxon House. Residential facilities. Parents of children with developmental disabilities were actually counseled to put their children in institutions where they could get the proper care. And we had the Exxon House bursting at the seams. We had the boys' home on Waterford Bridge Road. And back then, normalization started. Wolfensberger released a document called, a concept called normalization, which argued for the right of these citizens with developmental challenges, regardless of how complex, to live fully normalized lives. So what's normal for an 8-year-old without a disability should be normal for an 8-year-old with a disability. And the complexities in making that happen is the community's responsibility, not the family's responsibility. So we, I was a part of, but I was really hard into it, into a group home in which I was the live-in supervisor with 2 young men who had been institutionalized their whole lives. And my job was to teach them how to live on their own. And we did that fairly successfully. We had our challenges, but across the city there were numbers of boards as government was trying to close down Exxon House and places like that and move these citizens into the community. And there were a number of boards, all operated by citizens. They weren't they were government funded and government supported, but the responsibility to ensure appropriate programs and appropriate developmental trajectories for these citizens was the community. So we had concerned citizens sitting on these boards who were operating these homes. And they were very successful in moving people into independent living. But it wasn't just the residential supports that made that successful. It was the day program supports, the rights of these citizens to have meaningful days and to live normalized work days and to have socially valued roles and have strong social lives independent of their families. Like, I'm 56 years of age right now, and it's not normal for me to be the responsibility of my mother. I mean, you would raise your eyebrows if Mom, heaven help me, was responsible for my life. And if I had a sibling who was 54 who had a disability, Mom shouldn't be involved in that, my sibling's life. So the responsibility should not fall to citizens or to parents. It should fall to the communities. And we have a long history of that in our province, and one that we're very proud of for citizens with developmental disabilities that can help inform what we need to do now for citizens with autism spectrum disorder.
Okay, thank you. Janet, when you were looking for a suitable or the right kind of place for your nephew, what became obvious to you as you were trying to find something suitable?
Well, we had 2 challenges. One was the immediate because of sudden death. And so we had to very quickly access services, determine what they were, who to call. Who here has been poised in front of a phone thinking, who the heck do I call? What is the number? How do I find someone? In Christopher's case, his mother had died at home. It was only a miracle that he was able to inform someone. He cannot use the telephone, but he had the presence of mind to go get somebody and who was nearby. And from there, we dealt with both the police, the mental health mobile team at the Waterford Hospital, who had been called by the police because they believed Christopher had a mental health issue, when of course he was autistic. And then we were able to expedite with Eastern Health to get an individual supported arrangement in his apartment where he had lived with his mother to ensure his safety and security and his care. That was the beginning, really the tip of the iceberg, because he, as it turned out, Dave spoke about how unique the spectrum is. Indeed, it's a broad spectrum. We had no idea as a family. I am Christopher's only relative here in Newfoundland. Everyone else is living elsewhere. And so there is no network. There is no family network. I'm it. So as I worked with family doctors, tried to access records, I had no knowledge of autism, not in the way that a caregiver and an advocate, if I were a parent, that I would have that knowledge. I was an aunt, so I did not have the in-depth knowledge. And as it turned out, his needs were both unique and very complex. They included comorbidities, as is often the case with autism. It included critical medical needs that had not been attended to because his caregivers had had difficulty accessing program systems and meeting his needs as his grandmother aged and herself required care. Dave, to your point of who is caring for the parent and who is caring for the person with autism, Christopher required a range of needs. So we worked in this first instance as he had his basic needs met to find out precisely what he needs. So we envisioned a goal, his best life possible. Chris expressed that to us. He wanted his own life. He deserved his own life. And so we worked with family physicians. We worked with people who helped assess where he was, and putting together really what I call the circle of care, because it takes not one person, not only a parent, not only a caregiver, but lots of expertise until we had a firm grasp on what Chris's social, medical, intellectual, psychological needs were, and it was a complex picture. Once we had a sense of that and could begin putting in place the things that he needed, and that included emotional support. He had lost his grandmother, his mother, the two most important people in his life. We realized, of course, that it was more than just meeting his needs, ensuring that his medical care and other things were in place. It meant Chris connected with community, Chris having a life. And we were very fortunate in that to have the support of the Autism Society, one of the first groups I turned to. They provided information, they provided advocacy, they helped me understand what I could do best for Chris, and they worked tirelessly because he had no one else, and without them, and the Disability Policy Office within the Department of Children, Seniors and Social Development. People there were also tremendous, and Stella's Circle. Well, what's our before and after picture? So on October 18th, 2015, Chris was left in the world very sick, critically ill, with no one, and now working through with Eastern Health, who the Autism Society supported us in educating social workers who were unfamiliar with Autism, who we were helped very much because of an assessment that was done that really gave us evidence to talk with social workers to say, look, this is where he is, this is what he needs, and having that assessment was absolutely vital because they were questioning whether he needed supports at all. As it turned out, he needed and was assessed at the very highest level of need. And we knew that a community-based or shared living situation that would allow him space and time for himself, but also connection with community, because he had lost his family. His immediate family was the best thing. And so after many, going through many options, shared care, alternative family, none of these could meet his needs. Lo and behold, Andrew's Place revealed itself to us. This is a community-based supportive living arrangement. The infrastructure is the City of St. John's within their social housing portfolio. It's located in Pleasantville, and it was started by a group of Easter Seals parents who recognized that their adult children required support to live their own lives, and also for the instance, as with Chris, when parents were no longer there. So after a period of further assessment and interviews, and most importantly in this was, of course, asking Chris and having him become familiar with Andrew's Place, was this where he saw himself? Was this where he saw a home? And as it turned out, he did indeed see himself there, and he's been living there since December of 2017. When you go into Andrew's Place, it's 6 individual apartments and a huge common living area. There's 24/7 care provided. You have to really put sunglasses on when you go in because Chris's happiness will blind you as you approach him. He has friends, he has care, he has safety and security. Because they're there together, there's some wonderful economies of scale for accessing programs. He is doing music. He swims 3 times a week. He has daily physical activity. All of this is fundamental to both his physical and mental health.
Okay, Janet, I'm going to try
Yes,
to move
and-
things
yeah.
along, but I'm glad that it ends up, I'm sure we'll come back to his story throughout the night, because I notice someone is waving at me to get attention
Yes,
before
sorry.
I introduce someone else. Do you want to wrap up quickly?
Yes, I was just going to say that in seeking out services and support, it's the preparing in advance. Ideally, if Chris had had transition planning and advance planning, if there had been capacity, then crises might have been averted, and that it took quite a circle of care to save his life.
Okay. I was going to introduce Bruce, but Trudy, you're waving at me. You're
Yep.
seeking my attention, so...
I'm just going to talk a bit about concrete supports, not sort of the generalized stuff, but just in terms of my own life. Now, I'm comparatively low needs on the spectrum, but I needed a life skills coach to help me with things like financial budgeting, to help me with things like how to keep my environment clean. And even now, I still can't do that. I've got a cleaning lady who comes in once every 3 weeks to help me out with that.
If it's any comfort, neither can I.
I already knew how to cook, though I didn't do it all that often before. And I already knew how to do laundry and how to shop. But those are some of the basic kinds of needs that we need to make sure are taught. The basic life skills, first of all, how to keep yourself clean, how to keep your environment clean, how to handle money, that's a very, very important one, how to shop for food, how to cook, how to do laundry, how to take transportation, how to communicate if you run into issues, if you're nonverbal, if you're partially verbal, if you're fully verbal but sometimes you're ability to speak shuts down. Those are some of the basic supports that need to be looked at.
Okay. It's fantastic, but I just want to make sure that I share enough time with everybody.
Yes.
And I know we'll be coming back to these kinds of issues throughout the night. Bruce, when you think about these concrete aspects that Trudy's bringing up in terms of the development of a plan to actually meet these special needs, why is a chance like tonight to talk about this? How does this all fit into what it is that your organization is trying to do?
Oh, it's very relevant because some of the things that people have talked about are really about a rights-based approach to accessing housing and supports and choosing what you need and having a spectrum, let's use the word spectrum, of supports and housing options available in a community. And we haven't got the full deck of cards yet in St. John's or Newfoundland, Labrador. I don't know that any jurisdiction in the country yet has nailed the housing puzzle completely, but we have a really good shot now because, as I said in my introduction, not since the Second World War is Canada and the provincial territorial governments, and in our case, St. John's is the only municipality in all of Atlantic Canada with a housing role, meaning they own and operate 450 units of housing. They're looking to develop more. They've got skin in the game. And so part of the answer is going to be a range of housing options. What's that going to look like? From what Andrew's Place offers to people having at the other scale of independence in the community supports that come to them that are of their choice, but also access to social engagement and opportunities to have meaningful activities depending on what the needs might be. And also a lot of education has to be done as part of the provincial plan, and I would say as part of a national plan, for professionals in the field who may not have the level of awareness they need. I don't think the Autism Society can do it all alone. I mean, you're really punching above your weight here. Families are totally punching above their weight here, carrying huge burden. So when I look at our homework back at End Homelessness St. John's is to help create the catcher's mitt for some of the federal resources that are going to come from a new national housing strategy that we've advocated for together with you. It's now finally going to come in some shape or form over the next 10 years, but starting next year, 2019. And that's going to be hundreds of thousands of new affordable housing units, and these aren't going to be all government delivered units. The approach is going to be often community driven, community developed. So there may be a role, I'll just put it out there, for the Autism Society in this space, much like groups like Stella's Circle. When I first got involved in addressing homelessness in St. John's, the AIDS Committee was talking about a Tommy Sexton Center for people living with AIDS and HIV and risk of homelessness as well. So groups have stepped into this space. It's not for everybody. So that might be an area where we could sit down and start looking at some options. The other is, through End Homelessness St. John's, I'll just give a couple quick examples. One of the reasons we've seen a reduction in use of our emergency shelters is because we never had an air traffic control system for addressing homelessness in our community before. We have, it's almost like you've got a whole bunch of airlines out there. Stella's Circle, Choices for Youth, Newfoundland Housing, City of St. John's, we're all a bit guilty of it, all trying to work together, but it's fairly slow and cumbersome and people get lost between the cracks. And if you don't know when you open up a phone book the names of all these organizations and services and what they're about, you can be a bit lost. So we're going to be developing an online system map that's going to be really easy to search, that's going to be navigatable for housing and supports in the community. And we also have now a weekly table that's our air traffic control table. So anybody who is either homeless or at imminent risk of homelessness, that's our part of the housing puzzle, is more the homelessness end of the equation. So I apologize to some extent for that because part of my expertise is there, but we know that there's a broader need for people facing housing instability, but I'm also at those tables too. I just don't have as much, I'm not operating those, but I can go back to those with the needs I'm hearing here tonight. So in that, we just had one of those tables today. We have a list of people who are presented, and then we match them with programs and services in the community with their consent, of course, and their engagement. And we've seen people who've had some of the longest and most recurring experiences of homelessness in our community now finally accessing housing. And the key here is housing of their choice, not a choice between bad and really bad, but a choice with some of the supports that they need. And again, of their choice as well. So I think it's the housing first, rights-based approach that we need to look at.
Right.
The other piece I'm excited about with the national strategy is the feds have just been having consultations on developing a legislated right to housing in Canada. What's that going to look like when we talk about the community that's in this room here tonight that's concerned about ensuring inclusion of residential options across the spectrum for people living with autism? So again, I can be helpful in trying to connect with the Autism Society and through others to help make sure that that dialogue really engages your voice as well.
Okay, going to move on to question 2. There's one person I see here who knows that I'm pretty ruthless when it comes to timing and interviews, and that's MHA Lorraine Michael, who's here at the front. So I want to say hello, Lorraine. I think we're both here to actually have some thoughtful discussions as opposed to what we've witnessed in your place of work over the last week. Anyway, so Lorraine Michael's here. If there's any other MHAs that I know there are a lot of policymakers, other people here, but I just wanted to note that there is an MHA present. All right, question 2. The IQ to 70 criterion has been a means for determining service provisions for a very long time, and many in the community and many in this room may well point to this criterion being a barrier to getting services that are needed. The current provincial government says it's going to change this, but let's discuss why it's important to do that change sooner rather than later. Jacqueline.
My son has a high IQ, and as a child there were always issues, but he was very bright, and there was structure and routine, which I realized served him exceedingly well. In adolescence, I guess there was less structure, and that's when issues really did seem to escalate. And I have spent years and years trying to seek help for my son through Eastern Health and outside Eastern Health as well. It was virtually impossible to navigate the system. I was sent from one place to another in circles, and always found myself back at square one. The waiting lists were incredibly long, and in the interim there were no supports. The professionals that my son saw did not pick up on or figure out the root cause of his issues. I got to a stage where I didn't know where to go or what to do. I'd explored every avenue. I'd knocked on so many doors. Through the NLTA, I got to meet with a counsellor, and she said, the behaviour that you're describing sounds as though your son might be on the spectrum. In all the years of seeking help, that was the very first time I had heard that suggested. So with her help, she directed me to a private agency specializing in autism spectrum disorder. And after some time, my son was tested and diagnosed with being on the spectrum with ASD. At the age of 30, he's high functioning. So with a definitive diagnosis, I went back to Eastern Health and I said, my son has a disability. He was also found to have ADHD and OCD as well. Very often, ASD doesn't come in isolation. It often is accompanied with other issues as well. And I said, what supports can be put in place? And it was then that I learned that because of the IQ 70 policy, he didn't fit the criteria because his IQ was far too high. Unfortunately, his emotional intelligence was not taken into account, and emotional intelligence is essential for successful functioning in society, and his emotional intelligence is low. I retired from work and I became his 24/7 caregiver. There were escalations and outbursts that were sometimes quite scary. And I didn't have the skills to know how to handle. And there didn't seem to be anyone at Eastern Health to help me. Things became worse and my health began to suffer. I went to Eastern Health and I said, I have a son who has a disability and I'm really his 24/7 caregiver. I have to be on the alert at all times. And could someone come in and respite? Could I have just a couple of hours to recharge my batteries? And again, because of the IQ 70 policy, I wasn't able to get any help. Life at home was very, very difficult. My daughter was living at home and still at university. And for once, and I say this, my son took all of my energy and all of my time. He took priority because he was so needy. So this time, I really had to put my daughter first for a change and look at her life. Her life had been miserable growing up in the same house with my son who had not received any therapy. And I had to put her first, and I also had to think of myself and recognize that I wasn't getting any younger and that I really needed to take care of my health. And so I had to make the most heartbreaking and devastating decision of my life and not allow my son to live at home any longer, which meant that he was homeless. And I think somewhere at the back of my mind, I had this notion that if the situation was really desperate, that support from somewhere should come. But that didn't happen. And so, with living with ASD, where change is extremely challenging for him. Over the last 2 years, he has been in 2 shelters and 3 different apartments. He's had 5 moves in 2 years. And last summer, he had a psychotic episode. I think some of the things that triggered that breakdown were his feelings of despair and hopelessness and helplessness and his inability to cope with life. Also his isolation and his loneliness due to his difficulty with social interaction, and his anxiety and his depression. He was at the Waterford Hospital for several days, and then he went home. He went back to his apartment without any support, without any therapy, and without any follow-up. He's 33 and he's still not receiving any therapy.
Wow. Mm-hmm. I'm very rarely lost for words, but I am right now.
Can I comment on that?
Please.
I'm never lost for words, unfortunately. Jacqueline, it's a very powerful story, and it's almost an outrage that we're sitting here in 2018 hearing it in this community, right? After all we know about the needs of children. Jacqueline, I would say that the K-12 system failed you terribly, because if we had early identification and intervention, your son would have been identified. He will have had the appropriate supports. There will have been transition planning. There will have been life skills instruction. There will have been preparation for you. You will have been empowered. All the verbiage we have around K-12 education and special education will have kicked in and educated you, even though, ironically, you're an educator. And it didn't happen. And it's why in the Premier's Task Force, one of the biggest pushes that I had in that task force was these kids have to be in school full-time, period, regardless of the severity of their need. The ones who are the hardest to program for are the ones who need to be in school the most, because they need to learn these skills before they have the outcomes that your child has had. And transition planning has to be a part of the K-12 system. We know these kids are leaving our system. We know what they do not know and what they need to know to live independently. Get them ready. Start early. Get them ready. Transition planning, reams have been written on transition planning. The department has a really good transition planning document. It's never followed. Right? We have all the language around, adaptive domains and planning for these kids. We don't listen to it. And autism is the only condition out there in which you need 2 diagnoses to qualify for supports. IQ 70 means you have an intellectual disability along with autism. Well, that's like showing up at the CNIB and saying, I'm blind, and them saying, well, sure, you can hear, you're good to go. You don't need 2 disabilities to qualify for CNIB supports, right? Or me going to the Eastern Health and saying, I think I'm having a heart attack, and they're saying, yeah, you are, but your lungs are good, you're good to go. But autism is the one condition out there in which you need 2. You got to have an intellectual disability along with autism to be severe enough to qualify for supports designed to treat you and empower you as a typical citizen. And I believe, actually, having spent 9 long months inside Confederation Building last year, I actually believe that government is committed to removing the IQ 70 because no one can counter an argument on it. You have a discussion on IQ 70, no one can put forward a logical argument around IQ 70. So I actually believe that's going to go, finally. Not in time for you, unfortunately.
May I just reply to that?
Sure.
And I do agree with everything you say. I think in fairness, we're going back a number of years when there wasn't the awareness or the knowledge or the training. Even now, many health professionals are not immersed or do not have in-depth training in autism. And I think that going through school, it just wasn't picked up on. And I think also that very often with high functioning is an invisible disability. It isn't something that you readily see. And I really don't like to say this, but sometimes I almost wished that it was something that you could see. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because then there would have been the help. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Trudy, I want to ask you a question. As someone who describes herself as having autism and being autistic, rather than IQ, what would be a better indicator to determine individual needs for those on the spectrum?
That is a difficult question, I will admit. I'm one of those, I was gifted, considered gifted as a child. My diagnosis didn't happen until I was almost 36. As Jacqueline mentioned, there are more quotients out there than just intellectual intelligence quotient. There's emotional quotient, which, yes, a number of autistics do have difficulty with. There's the social quotient, which, again, a number of us have difficulty with. But I'm actually going to say the first measure, not the only measure, but I said the first measure, is look at the DSM-5 severity criteria. The new, well, I say new, it's been in existence since 2013. The DSM-5 got rid of the high functioning and low functioning labels and basically put the, I'll say, symptoms of autism into 2 categories, each of which has a severity level. These severity levels can change throughout one's life, and basically it sort of goes 0, needs no support for that. 1 needs minimal support, 2 needs definite support, and 3 needs major support. So I would say that's a starting point, but it can't be the end point because so many of our needs are so individualized. I really think we need to do a lot more talk around this as to how do we determine how much support is needed. But yeah, I'd say look at the DSM-5 severity levels as sort of your starting point because they're the measure there is based on what do you need support with.
Thank you. David, I'm not going to quote you on this. Given your contacts within various departments, when you mention that you think the government's going to get rid of it, do you have a timeline in mind for that?
No, I don't have a timeline. I would guess before the next election. I think it's going to be an election issue unless they're very careful. And I think they're highly motivated to be seen as moving forward on their files, this one being one of them. I would suspect, though, it's going to be more linked to the Autism Action Plan. I think it's going to be part of that Autism Action Plan. And I think we really need to get in front of that action plan. We cannot wait for government to come out with the action plan. We got to go in and do submissions that this is what should be in the action plan. And you know, we want this in the action plan. One of the things that has to be in the action plan is respite services for families.
Oh,
you know, mandatory placement for children. No such thing as part-time placement for these children, no matter how severe they are. No matter how severe they are. A school should not be allowed to send a child home because their needs are too complex to teach them. Shouldn't happen. It's illegal. It's against the Schools Act. Supported employment and significant day programs should be part of the action plan. And I think we need to have a structure in place where there's a continuum of residential supports that is the responsibility, the shared responsibility of communities, not social services. Right? The citizen, us as a community, should be proactive in recognizing the human rights of these citizens to gainful employment and supportive living arrangements.
Okay, I want to get to the, can you make it quick because I want to get to the last question.
Just a very quick thing.
Yeah.
We also want to look at the government of Ontario. They got rid of IQ 70 a couple of years ago. My sister is a speech-language pathologist in Ontario, and they've had no success with it. So we want to look at what they've done and see where they've gone wrong, and sort of say, okay, we're going to try something different to do this.
Okay, good advice. Question 3, too often our system is reactive, and then we'll get to your questions. Too often our system is reactive rather than proactive. Recent statistics from the Public Health Agency of Canada indicate that the number of those with autism between the ages of 5 and 17 is, I don't want to throw too much math at you, it's 1 in 57 here in Newfoundland and Labrador. What needs to happen to prepare this province and all of us for this wave of children who will eventually become adults who are really the subject of what we're talking about? I'll ask you, David, what needs to be done to help families and adults plan for the future?
Well, I think we need to train our care providers first and foremost. There's a huge need for training for educators, for nurses, for social workers. We have to recognize that us as professionals, we weren't trained in this. You know, I did no courses, 0 courses in autism, and I'm the department head of special education in the province. So we need to be able to recognize that and say, because it didn't exist, there wasn't an option. It's not as if I opted out of the course on autism. There was no such thing. So I think if my profession didn't have that in their training, the other professions certainly didn't have it. So I think we need, the first step has to be increased professional development and recognition that there's a deficit of knowledge. And families are paying the price for that in all service sectors.
Okay. I see you. Yes. Go. Jacqueline?
I agree very, very much. We have the highest number of children in the whole of the country, 1 in 57. And I think this is just the tip of the iceberg because how many adults are yet to be diagnosed, adults who have sort of slipped under the radar because they're being enabled to function and live because of the support of their parents. What happens when those parents are no longer able to provide that care and support? But whilst the recognition by the government of the need to change the IQ 70 policy gives hope. And it's certainly a step in the right direction. If a magic wand were to be waved right now and it was changed, and this ties in with what you were saying about training, what exactly do we have in place in terms of programs that are directly geared towards improving the lives of adults on the spectrum what in-depth training is there right now? Intensive, extensive, in-depth training and programs of education for our health professionals and educators. What exactly would we offer right now? I know there have been gains and progress made with children, but adults. So yes, there definitely needs to be, we need to be putting something in place right now, getting together a plan, an action plan for how we're going to educate and train to be able to cope with such a complex issue as ASD is.
Anybody else in the panel want to chime in?
Well, one of the things that I know was instrumental in ensuring that Chris landed where he is now and has the hope of a future was we put together with his needs assessment a plan. We developed an individual plan for him that met his needs, and across a range of domains we had identified what he needed, and we stuck with it. And we insisted on it, and we had help in doing that, and we had evidence backing that up. These individualized needs plans are central then to putting together other things. And if you're going to line up care, they have to be part of it. Your son was missed and did not have either diagnosis nor that in place, and you're still fighting that battle. And that is something I know is being worked on, I understand is being worked on in government right now. And when we talk, Dave, about the continuum of supports, if we don't have that plan, that can be updated as a person moves through their life at key points of transition when they fall off the cliff out of school and into the world, and that includes preparation for employment. Trudy, you had a wonderful list for yourself of the basic supports: life skills, financial, communications, personal care, medical, and others. That core defines what help is needed and what supports need to be in place. Without it, the individual doesn't have that ability to navigate or have someone help navigate.
I was just going to add to it, like thinking if we were going to add things, if I had a magic wand to add to housing plan locally and provincially as part of a response to the issues we're hearing tonight, have paid dedicated navigators, life coaches, and then you also need to have some supports funds to be able to use for the things you're going to need if you're depending on where you are on the residential continuum. So when I think of one of the programs we have that Stella Circle and Choices for Youth co-delivers on our behalf, Front Step, for those who've had long experiences of homelessness and recurring experiences, it has those things. And it's kind of magic because groups have had to go to AESL and other departments sort of begging for these things, you know, and sometimes they come, sometimes they don't, but it's right there in the drawer with the worker, the case manager who's working with that person and that family. Also, where it makes sense, a family-centered approach, so the family's part of the housing solutions and the transition planning related to housing. And I'm thinking of a million things we can be doing that I'm taking away as homework, because part of my selfish reason for being here tonight was to learn, to take away some things we need to be doing and be doing better to respond. And the city right now, our partner, is doing a needs assessment for its new 10-year housing strategy. The City of St. John's has never had a 10-year housing plan. Everybody's getting one, so it's all the rage these days. Federal, provincial, municipal. So this city, we've advised through the Affordable Housing Working Group, is you need to be talking to people with lived experience. So they've engaged a consultant to do some of that work. So I'm thinking, right after this meeting, I want to talk to some of my fellow panelists in the Autism Society about how we build that bridge so that conversation is part of the needs assessment that's going to then generate the types of housing options that we're going to be developing. The last thing I'll say about housing is it's been a missing link because it actually has been missing in action for too long in our country. We had a dark period from the late 1980s until just now. The taps are being turned on to a bigger extent. So we've had sort of a slow IV drip approach where a few ribbon cuttings here and there on different housing options like Andrew's Place. Yay, that's great. And kudos to the groups that made that happen. But we need to scale that up to thousands and thousands so that there's a range of options that are out there. And that's where I think we should be joining together to think of some ideas for a range of housing options that are partly the ones that we build, and other housing options that are about the life supports that go to people where they choose to live in the community that may not be an Andrew's Place option but are other parts of the continuum.
Can I quickly add that part of my reason why I have hope for the government's autism strategy is that I'm pretty certain they're about to conduct a jurisdictional review around residential supports. What's happening in the other provinces in this area? A jurisdictional review around residential supports for citizens with autism. So I think they're looking to be informed by what the other provinces are doing, what's working, what's not working, what's needed. And I suspect that's going to be unrolled really soon, which will help this.
Okay. Does anybody want to add stuff before I go to questions? Did you have a thought, Trudy?
I had two very quick ones.
Sure.
One was that models do exist here and elsewhere. This is not something that has to be thought up or invented. Bruce, to your point, the federal government does have money now in the infrastructure program. Planning is happening in the city of St. John's. There is an urban advantage here for those living outside of St. John's. Advocacy services access enormously difficult. The other thing that really has struck me through our own recent experience and work is that Newfoundland has 1 in 57 living with autism. It has the highest number of, most rapidly aging population in the province. Co-generational, multi-generational models are a real thought that might be quite exciting. There are synergies there that would be very exciting.
Okay. Shall I move things along? I have your permission. Maybe a round of applause for our panel, which have given us a lot to think about. So remember, there are those cards. If you're shy or bashful or you've got laryngitis, if you want to write your questions on that. There's also a microphone. If you want to pose your question yourself, you can come right here. And if not, then I will just whip out some of the off-the-rack journalistic questions that we ask in these kinds of things. Sure. No, I think the microphone's there. Should I place that in the middle? Or is it that mic here?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, one of the things I think that along with the homelessness is I think you've got to attach trained personnel. When Trudy moved here and we tried to get help for her, I found the College of Occupational Therapists, the College of Psychologists, the College of Psychiatrists. I tried to get in touch with everybody. Nobody knew anything about autism. Trudy, in order to get diagnosed, went up to St. Clair's and said, "Here's the test you give me." That was the extent of the knowledge here about autism. And unless we also start teaching people about autism, yes, I agree, we need homes for these adults, but we also need people who are trained attached to them. We have never been able to find an occupational therapist for Trudy.
Yes.
We fell into a social worker and we fell into a psychologist. But when John and I pop off, so does our money. You know, these things have to really be looked into.
Do you want to ask somebody a question, or is that a comment?
No, it's more a comment, really.
Right.
So that's something that also should go into any sort of plan that goes forward with the housing. And I would love to see a den mother type housing
You obviously have a lot of support in the room.
I've spoken about it before.
Good for you.
Does anybody want to comment on that? Comment? Or should we go next question? Question? Does somebody else have a question? Could you state your name, please?
My name is Elaine Dobbin, and I don't always need a mic because everybody tells me I have a big mouth. So, first of all, Dave, I hope you're right when you say what you say about the IQ 70, because our past government committed to it, and this present government, we're going to implement it as soon as they got into power. And how long has it been now? And to mention the needs assessment, the Autism Society had one done. I'm sure, are you aware of the?
Yeah.
And that's almost 2 years old now. We're still waiting. And as far as the housing issue is concerned, which is beyond our capacity at the Autism Society of Newfoundland and Labrador, but with early intervention, I think we are making a real difference in the community. And we've come a long way, and we have to give the government credit in this area for the early intervention program. They are now basically diagnosing within a 2-year period. So that's a huge difference. Also, on the Avalon, I don't know if everybody's aware, but there was an independent study done. Yes, there's 1 in 57 born with autism in Newfoundland and Labrador, but there's 1 in 40 on the Avalon. And I'll ask you, Dave, how are they going to address the needs? It's great, it's huge. To me, it's almost like a
Tsunami.
Yeah, absolutely. A cyclone is going to hit the Confederation building, especially when all of these young people start getting older, as some of the complaints we're hearing now we're experiencing. So it's going to be a real issue in the future for all of our young people today as they get older.
Yes, with the urbanization of high needs citizens, it's not just unique to autism. We see across the province children with complex medical needs, children with justice issues, children with all kinds of issues moving towards the city because there's the perception that there's more care here, there's more services here. It's completely misleading because the system here is overwhelmed. And in fact, on the task force, what we found was that quite often outside the city, it's working better. Inside the city, there's so much need and so much complexity and sometimes so much service, ironically, that it's always someone else's problem. For example, part-time placement, that's like school placement, kids being in school in part-time places, that was almost exclusively a St. John's issue. Outside the city, it wasn't happening. Just the community was taking responsibility. You couldn't send, Mrs. Smith's child home because they knew Mrs. Smith was working at the fish plant. So they kept them in school. But in the city, school principals think, well, I'm not taking that child, someone else can take them. Or a doctor could say, I'm not going to service that child, someone else would take them. So outside the city, I think to get to an answer, I think how do we respond to this in the city and in the province is that, A, we can't expect government to do it all, right? Because the government is our tax dollars, and our tax dollars are being increasingly stretched. But I go back to my experience 35 years ago, in which it wasn't government's responsibility to ensure quality programs for these citizens, it was the community's responsibility. We took the responsibility as concerned citizens. The people who chaired the boards or who sat on the boards that ran these homes were citizens. And we made sure. And government funded it, and sometimes we fundraised for it, but it was our collective responsibility. And you're right, the tsunami of autism that's coming through our school system now is going to really tax this province. And we need to get in front of that. We need to be having conversations like the one we're having tonight. It's unfortunate that it's 2018 and this is the first time we're talking about residential supports for citizens on the spectrum.
I would just like to add something. This tsunami has been hitting us already. The only reason that the survey that Public Health did for those numbers does not include adults is because the adult information is very vague and unverified. But, we look here, we've got 2 people here involved with autism who were diagnosed late, diagnosed in our 30s. There's a lot more who have fallen through the cracks, in part because the diagnostic criteria has gotten better over the years. We're seeing more knowledge around what autism is. So I would say the tsunami's hit already. We're just not seeing the results because they're not obvious at the moment.
Or they're showing up in other systems of care, like
Yes,
homelessness.
yes.
Yes.
What upsets me is the waste of potential because there haven't been the supports. Because very often, depending of course on the severity and where you are on the spectrum, but like in my son's case, for example, he has strength in math. He excels in that. And with the correct support system, he could have been a contributing member of society. And very often with autism, as I said, depending on where you are on the spectrum, there are areas where individuals really excel and show brilliance. But the other things sort of get in the way of that unless there are the supports. And when I think of the loss of potential to become contributing members of society, where individuals can feel a sense of achievement and increased self-esteem and feelings of self-worth, and be able to live a life that's worth living and have hope for the future and have happiness. But when these other issues are not addressed, they impede the potential. And my son is 33. Is he going to be 43 before anything's done, with half his life wasted, when he could have possibly, potentially, been a contributing member of society?
I think your poignant remark actually allows me to get into this question from the audience, and the question is, make sure I can see this properly. A factor related to homelessness is unemployment. A plan that focuses on homelessness also needs to have an element that deals with support in the workplace and finding a job. Will this / could this be part of the conversation?
Absolutely.
I think that sounds like something you should explain.
Yeah, a resounding yes. Yes, absolutely. Many of the organizations that we're involved with have employment-related programs, education-related programs that are built into the range of services they provide. But again, thinking about this action plan, as specific as we can be about what the needs would be, what the gaps are, so that we can be looking at how we fill them and we can deploy resources in those areas. If there's stuff we need to pilot that hasn't been done before that we think is cool, that's working elsewhere, we could try it out. That's another opportunity with a housing strategy that's a bigger scale than it ever was before. It's easier to do those types of things and then scale them up later once you see how they work. But yeah, we've got many examples of that in our community, and I think we need more. So there is a national and there's a provincial discussion around poverty reduction, and that has to be addressing people's ability to earn an income and to be able to support them with the education, training, and other life supports they need to be able to get to and from work and contribute to society if they choose to in that way.
Mm-hmm. And I would add just financial support in general is definitely an issue. I mean, we look at the unemployment rate and it's high for autistics. And some of that is because of our sensory issues, our executive function issues, difficulties in social communication. Some of it is also because we get more if we're on government support.
What do you mean?
If you're on income support, all your meds are paid for by NLPDP. Your rent is paid, or at least a substantial portion of your rent is paid, and sometimes NL housing helps out. all those kinds of things, they add up. I mean, at the moment, I'm on CPP disability. My parents have to pay for my meds because otherwise I wouldn't have enough money to live on. And employment options available don't necessarily give even that much money.
Sorry?
When you try to go to work, and it, I don't know, like, I know you're supposed to get money from work, but that's your paycheck from work to pay your rent, but, like, creates anxiety, you can just get, like,
Subsistence.
yeah,
Yeah.
or when you work, because you're showing your pay stubs, and it's like mail that thing, and it's like a lot of paperwork to figure out how much rent you gotta pay, and it creates anxiety. It's all dealt with there, and you're in somewhere, not even in the same time, you know, like, the doctor person.
Right.
Just to clarify, Tom was talking about the AES system and income support. And if you have employment while you're on income support, you have to provide pay stubs so that they can determine, okay, how much you get this 2 weeks because you've already received so much from employment, type of thing. So that's also a difficulty that really has to be looked at in terms of financial support.
You know, I'm always talking about the wide breadth of abilities of people with autism is difficult, and the various struggles that different families face, because all families, you know, struggle is hard for all families, and so it's. But I do want to talk about the people who are more severe on the spectrum. And I suppose to take away a little bit of your optimism, I'm so glad, Judy and Janet, that you were able to find appropriate living conditions. But I can say that most people I know, especially those on the more severe end of the spectrum, certainly cannot. And there is a thing, and I'd love to hear from Bruce, which is going to be my question, you know, how can the community get more involved in supporting those who are more affected when, or understandably, organizations cream? Because if you only have a limited number of dollars and you need to get your numbers up to show the government you're really working hard and whatever, you take the easier cases, or you take the cream from the top. And I would say the ones who often fall to the bottom are the most needy. And I look around this room and I know there are people who were in the 90s taking care of their non-verbal children. I know that when I went, and I feel ashamed almost at 58 to be whining, when I know that there are people in their 90s taking care of their disabled children. But when you know, after much, I can't tell you the fussing of, and certainly Lorraine and other people helped, of trying to get through the bureaucracy of community supports, when we, you know, finally managed to access, of course, which we have to pay for, behavioral aids to help with our son, who's living in a family home with other children, to help with his challenging behavior and irritability. When I've, you know, fought the way up through the system to Carol Byrne, who's the regional manager of Eastern Health Community Supports, and she said, "Oh, well, now we have that worked out. That's good, Brenda. Now you can come back when you're 75 and we'll talk about transitioning." So, you know, it's hard for me to be optimistic when we're talking about really high needs, and they're telling me to come back. I hope I managed to 75, but boy, it didn't make me feel any better at 56 being told that. So I'm wondering, when you hear and that, in fact, I think it is often at the moment the most disabled who are not getting serviced, because they are least able to advocate for themselves and they are so expensive to service that they are often being excluded from every bit of servicing, including the school system. And you know, we talk about Ontario. Ontario expels children who have challenging behaviors. You know, they are home with their parents with nothing. And I can, you know, give you lots of links of stories that are happening all the time. And we're now talking about the Schools Act being changed, and people like me who still have a child in school are very concerned that that School Act will now take away my child's right to an education. So in addition to not being optimistic about housing, you know, I'm concerned about the school. So I would like to ask, how do you think that, for instance, your organization might be able to support and really fight for the needs of some of the most disabled, who I think are the ones who are most falling through the cracks?
I hear you. I think the term we've started to use is chronically excluded. I mean, it's often the term has been complex needs. Yesterday we just had a discussion with, I don't know if she's in the room, Ashlyn Gogan, poverty reduction from the province, but working on one of the commitments that the government has on better serving people who have multiple and complex needs. And so there's a raft of recommendations that they've been working on internally. They were bringing it to us to kick the tires on to see whether we thought it was fit to eat. So we had a really good discussion yesterday, and I think this should be a discussion that's had with folks in this room, including the Autism Society, because some action has to come out of that. Because I agree with you, you can have all the great programs and services in the world, but if you don't, if you're only serving those that you're able to serve, and great complexity prohibits people from accessing what is a human right. Housing, education, some of the things that should be basic in this country, families have had to scrabble together to make it happen. So I guess I say I'm an optimist in the sense that I think we can make great progress here, because we have amazing people in this province. I moved here. I just think it's, you know, never going to leave. I love it here. I think the people, when they put aside their differences and the challenges, we can make it work. But I don't think we should expect the families to be doing all this on their own. And I heard your point as well, Elaine. Maybe the Autism Society doesn't dive in like some groups and build all the stuff. Get it. But maybe there's partnerships where we can develop, so we can make sure that housing providers that are developing options that are more at the more severe end of the spectrum, so that there's true permanent supportive housing in our community. We don't have enough. We know for people experiencing homelessness in St. John's, we need to build quite a bit more. So we've got supported housing where supports come and go during the day. They're not there all the time. But we don't have a lot of permanent supportive housing, which is where the supports are right on site 24/7. You never lose it. You have access to it. And I think we need to scale that up again in St. John's. So I guess my answer would be, let's develop something for our new plan. We're going to hatch it by 2019. So that is just around the corner. If you think of how long it takes to go from concept to blueprint to shovels in the ground to permits, that takes about a year to 2 years. So I think we should be thinking seriously within the action plan about the housing component. What's the built piece? How much of that do we need? And I'm thinking St. John's, but I know we need to be thinking provincially. So we'll be talking to our provincial colleagues that we work with as well on this. And then the other piece is, how much of this is about flexible mobile supports that go to people? And then how much of this is about scaling up the education of the professional services that support people in our communities to do this? We can take on as much of the housing stuff, because it relates to us, as we can. And we've got some new resources to play with this coming year. So I'm really excited about that. So that's part of my optimism here. And the nice thing is, we won't just be doing an End Homelessness St. John's plan. There's going to be, we hope, a provincial one, and we got to make sure we keep it true to what we're looking for coming in 2018-19, and then the national one, and we know that's coming because $20 billion's already been committed. Our province has signed on with $7 billion plus to put in its contribution towards it. So these dollars have to fall somewhere. But what I've seen before is, when you have a large national commitment, a lot of this stuff, by the time it actually gets to communities, it may not meet the needs if it's not actually designed and delivered by those communities. So you can spend as much as you want, you won't get good results and outcomes. That's where we want to make a difference. The last thing I'll say is, remember I mentioned coordinated access or air traffic control? We've got all these airplanes, i.e. housing providers, but no airport. You go to the airport, you drop your bag, something magically happens to your bag, it arrives in Toronto, you arrive in Toronto, safe and sound, easy peasy, you get on with your day. That's what we're trying to build in St. John's. It's never been done before, is an air traffic control system for preventing and ending homelessness. Our end of the pool is you know, people who are at imminent risk, a couple months away from being homeless, or are homeless. So it's not the full equation, but we're trying to knit it to what we need to have is a provincial plan that looks at coordinated access that's broader than that for people who are in severe housing instability, barely hanging on, and thanks to their families are able to keep it together. But you pull that support away or something goes sideways, it's gone. They should be part of a coordinated access system for the housing and supports too. I was at the table today. We had all of our groups sitting around together. They've never done this before in St. John's, working with the lists of people who are coming and going through that air traffic control system, and then we're able to match them to the supports, the housing, and they're on their way. The problem is, we've got a logjam, we don't have enough of the housing. So that's the part we need to fix, is to have more of that available. So I know it's a long answer, and I definitely want to have another chat with you in particular, and a few other folks in the room about the housing piece.
And I just want to add my support to your statement about, yeah, it's definitely the people with the most severe needs are falling through the cracks. I'm lucky in a lot of ways. My needs are not terribly severe, and even I've fallen through the cracks. I mean, there is too much of that happening. And so that's something for all of you listening here and all of you who are watching this on live stream or will watch this on YouTube to think about. What can we do to help deal with that issue as well?
Okay, I have a question here, but I'm going to get some clarification before I go with it. So you want to go ahead? Yeah. Just get closer to the mic for a second.
Hello?
Can you step down a bit?
Oh, I got to step down.
There you go.
Can I move it? Because I've got big feet. Is that better?
Yes.
Oh.
Thank you. Hi.
Hello.
Okay.
So can everybody hear me? Hello? Hello?
Okay, that's fine.
Do you have to stand that close to it? Okay, so, all right. So I am a prime example of the most unwanted conversation, because I can paint myself in any particular manner to fit into the most vulnerable part of society, and how I can turn that into a value. And what I mean by that is actual hours created, hours worked, and hours reduced within our healthcare system would give us a tool, give our finance minister a creative opportunity to use this 3-0 approach that he had to apply to a lifetime healthcare budgeting process. What I mean by that is, I'm someone who pipped off school, whether it's because I got bullied, because I just got raped of all avenues for me to ever be able to hold any type of self-confidence. And that put me in a situation of having no education, no skills when it came to the written power and ability to be able to defend my own rights. No matter how articulate I became, no matter how clear, or no matter how many ways, like I could say the same scenario, the same situation, in 3 different ways with 3 different tones, so that I would make sure that everybody could be on the same page, to the point that I don't know, but it almost gave me a split personality. How can anybody go and who has autism, like my son, he's on the Asperger scale. So I could give my son specific directions, right down to almost how many steps it would have to take for him to be able to go and find something, and he will get lost. If I send him to the grocery store, which is rare, even though people they talk about your money, they talk about what I spend on my money, and I'm on welfare. No, that's true. Now, I've wasted a lot of money in an addiction, and that addiction is smoking. So here I am, I'm like someone with autism. I'm sorry.
You're throwing a lot at us, right? So can you just get to the question, because I want to get to at least one more question.
Example right here.
Yeah.
I've been going door to door with an idea and how we would be able to use housing as a form of currency to be able to create jobs. So the security of me living in Newfoundland and Labrador housing, like he was mentioning to you, it can be a bit of caduffle every month when you don't know what type of hours. So it's better to go in with a contract of how to be able to get him that 105 maximum. He's allowed 105 maximum without ever having to go in and deal with all of these particular paperworks. So that can be relieved with government contracts for that 105. So instead of going with all this canopy approach where everything comes top down, I'm saying everything needs to go bottoms up. With everybody having to create their own job through the welfare system, using Newfoundland and Labrador housing, using what they already have with the numbers that they're specifying, and the open market, to making sure that everybody can have a peer system to get exactly what it is that they need right now. Wouldn't cost any money. So why are you talking? Why aren't they just doing it?
Well, there's lots of different ideas here, right? So that's a pretty extensive, elaborate process that you're suggesting. But you
got to start with one person and then copy it.
Pardon?
You got to start with one person
I agree.
and then copy it.
But for now, I'm just going to move on to the next and the last question of the evening, if you don't mind. And I know you can't make it to the mic because of your knees, and you say you've got a loud voice, so go for it.
Thank you. Anthony was being very kind when he said, I can't really see this. What he was saying was, I can't really read this. And I got all I can do to read my own writing, so understand, Anthony. I am the mom of a 41-year-old son for whom I have been advocating since he was 4 or 5 years old, as well as advocating for other mothers, sons, and daughters. My son's dad is just recently deceased, leaving me alone with our son, who has severe autism with several morbidities. We live in a community outside St. John's. As with our 2 daughters, we have purchased a building lot for Stephen to have his own home. We don't have the money to build his home for him. I don't. I would like you to be able to tell me, what can I do tomorrow?
Just thinking that one through. You own the land. You've bought the land. And you have land too. Okay. So I wonder if one of the options might be, there have been proposal calls in the past through the housing programs, and I think the new program could have this as well, the private stream, where affordable housing is provided on site. We just have to change some of the rules that would dissuade this from being developed, because many of the rules require you have to have a minimum of 4 units on the property. So, for example, grants of up to $40,000 capital provided to provide the units per unit on the site. But if you're talking about just for your son and his needs, then we should be looking at that. We should be designing and tailoring. You're bringing an asset to the table, plus your lifetime of care and support for your son. That should be factored in.
And he would be in the community where he's grown up.
Totally.
With his extended family. And his friends.
Yeah.
Where people know him, and he knows people.
Yeah.
And I recently mentioned this to a new social worker, and talking about planning for his future. And I said, I wouldn't expect his daughters, his sisters, to take over his care. They've grown up with autism their whole lives in their families. So I'm sure they'll always oversee him and advocate for him. And she said to me, oh, they wouldn't. Families usually take on. Within the past 6 months, I heard that.
But it's interesting because Bruce said he was here to learn, and that never had occurred to me. I just put on Twitter that up until tonight I actually thought I knew a lot about autism, but now I realize I know nothing. You said you were here to learn. I'd never even imagined the notion of people who have children on the spectrum actually coming to any community or level of government to say, hey, I'm not asking you for land, I've got the land.
Yeah.
I just need help building something for my kid,
Totally.
right? I mean, that's very interesting.
And we, for here in the city, one of the things we need to be looking at, Andrew's Place, interestingly, is built on federal land that was granted to us, i.e. the community with a plan to end homelessness, for $1. On the condition that we max out the housing on the property. So Habitat for Humanity went there. The City of St. John's built it for its first nonprofit housing since the 1990s there. NL Housing co-joined with them and put 20 units there. The Newfoundland Labrador Housing and Homelessness Network moved in there with social enterprise training programs. So Pleasantville is an area of uncharted territory because there's 65 acres of federal land there. We could get more acreage there and then get it for $1, and then we can be looking at some cool housing options on there. We've removed the land cost, which is a huge barrier for people. But I think in your case, you're already bringing an asset to the table that's so significant that it should be matched with a grant on the capital side to build the unit to go.
Okay, Bruce, I don't want to cut you off, but this will definitely be the last question. I feel a responsibility because of a question that this young guy raised. The question is, what are examples of best practices in rural areas of Newfoundland in terms of supportive housing, which bounces to you, I suppose, once again? Because I think even it's kind of a
rural?
Yeah. I think there's been a towny assumption through a lot of tonight's discussion.
I'm familiar with a few of them. There's people here in the audience who actually work province-wide on some of these issues as well with the provincial government, but a few that I'm familiar with are Community Mental Health Initiative in Corner Brook developed supportive housing in that community, again from the ground up through a community organization together with consumers, people with lived experience. And that model isn't too far from what we're talking about here. Engaging the people themselves in the development of the initiative, building a modest scale. And then what they also have in rural Newfoundland and Labrador are housing support workers that have been deployed who fan out and work to take supports to people where they currently live and provide the support so they don't lose their housing, they don't lose their access to supports, help them navigate public systems. And that's another way of doing it too. So there's the built stuff, and then there's the housing and supports that go to people. I also think we need to be thinking about home modification programs and repair. And we can also be thinking about these as job opportunities. We were talking about creating opportunities for people to engage in work. It's not for everybody, but trades training and employment in that area has been an area we've been very successful in our sector because we do the things we do. We have land, we have gardens that need to be maintained because they have green around them. Food is always there, and food is always a big thing. So that's why we have social enterprise cafes like the Hungry Heart. So those are in sort of the bailiwick of areas where we can be developing more employment opportunities too, as well as housing, and have more of a virtuous circle.
Okay, I'm going to wrap this up. I know that there's one more announcement to make, but I want to thank everybody on the panel, David, Bruce, Janet, Jacqueline, Trudy. I've certainly learned a lot. Now, for those of you who filled out a card and didn't get asked, I know that Tess is taking those questions, and that's Tess over there, and she'll take your card and they will try to get back to you if you didn't get your question answered. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. It's been an honor to be here, and I mean that sincerely, and I know my brain is thinking, okay, how do we get this on the air? So thank all of you very much. But I am going to call on David because he tells me he really isn't for a loss for words. So do you want to do this at the podium? You have an announcement of sorts.
No, I'm just going to introduce someone. So long story short, 30, 40 years ago, I was a member of the Council for Exceptional Children before all these special interest groups, such as the Autism Association, such as the Learning Disabilities Association, before all those special interest groups start to become independent and successful. We have one umbrella group, the Council for Exceptional Children, and we were very active in the province. We have a long history, and at the time we had a fair bit of money. We raised a lot of money over the years, and there's a little bit of money left. So I want to introduce my colleague, my mentor, my professor, Dr. Glenn Shepherd, to make a quick announcement on behalf of the Council for Exceptional Children.
Well, good evening. The piano has been silent tonight, but for me, There's lots of music here tonight, to my ears anyway. I have a stake in those conversations. I'm a father of a son who lives with my wife and I. He's 47. He has a disability. It's called Sotos syndrome. His needs are different from some other men his age. He functions quite well. He's unemployed at the moment, although he's been employed the longest time for 6 years, won an award for his being Employee of the Year. So that status hopefully will change soon. So it was a delight to be here. Before I make the announcement, I'd like to thank the panelists for their gift of ideas and experience and advocacy. I've been a professor, so I don't talk in 55-minute periods, but that may scare you that I might do that. Yes, I've been an active member of the Newfoundland Labrador chapter of the Council for Exceptional Children, which is an international organization with its headquarters in the United States, quite a large one. So what we've decided, and the other changes that have happened for David and I, he said that other organizations now have taken over some of the responsibilities that we were taking on in the early days, many years ago. Two of our dear colleagues have passed away. Dr. Wayne Nesbitt, who was a professor at Memorial University, a strong advocate for children with special needs, won the Newfoundland Citizen of the Year Award, and another close colleague, a member of the executive of the chapter, Brenda Smith, died just last year. She was also an active advocate, and in her final years, she was a civil servant in the Department of Education, a strong advocate for children with special needs. We've decided to take $10,000 from our chapter account and make an award to the Autism Society as a contribution to this initiative that they've now taken and in support of their leadership and their social engagement that we can see here tonight.
Okay, you'll have to invite me to these things more often. That's fantastic. What a great way to end the night. Of course, a lot of talk tonight about resources being a problem, and it's a very generous gesture. I know everybody in this room is thrilled that you made it. That's it. I hope you have a good night, and we'll see you around.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you. We have that 2,000. We have a little fun. So as long as it's a little piece of work that's going to tackle homelessness, we can do that. I'll send out the contact details. All right. Yes. And actually,